Really, really thank you very much for having me here tonight. Father John has been my teacher and my friend. It's getting on now. It's been 20 years, and tonight is Friday night. I'm Jewish. It's my Sabbath. I never go out on Friday night. I try to observe the Sabbath faithfully. But I consider Father John, really, what he does is holy work. So when he asks me to do it, I do it. The only other time he asked me to do something that was very difficult was when England were in the quarterfinals of the Euros, and he asked me to speak then, and I did it. So Father John, I just want to say always, and to honour what you've given me, and then I want to say, with all the sincerity of my heart, to give gratitude to the Church, to give gratitude to the Catholic Church, because it changed my life. I was doing a PhD, I was a very normal, kind of left of centre, sort of wannabe academic sort of person, and and then this was around about 1989, and my first real political engagement was with the Solidarity Union in Poland, with the resistance to communism, and I found it extremely inspiring, this combination of being a trade union, being Catholic, those things. I didn't know too much about it, but I was completely shocked when Solidarity won 98% of the vote in the election, and then decided to outlaw unions, destroy workers' rights, open up themselves to the International Monetary Fund, and I had to understand it. So I made this the topic of my PhD, and it made no sense to me, because after the Second World War, after Nazism, Germany rebuilt itself around Christian democracy and around social democracy, with respect for workers' rights, for trade unions, with worker representation on boards. It really intrigued me why Poland went the way that it did when there was such an obvious example of something better literally next door. So that led me to study, the importance of ideology and these things, but no one could explain to me. I did my PhD in Italy, and nobody could explain to me how this, what was the basis of this post-war German settlement with this, federalism and local power. I'll talk about it more with workers on the boards, with regional banks, with all these things. Marxists couldn't explain to it because it was so obviously a class compromise. Liberals couldn't explain it because it so obviously involved different groups in negotiation with each other. No one could explain it. And I was living in Italy, and an Italian friend of mine, that was the origin of all this, bought me, for my birthday, the encyclicals of Catholic social thought, and this was my transformative moment. Rerum Novarum is wonderful, but Laborem Exercens and then Centesimus Annus, the two by Pope John Paul II, were just magnificent to me. So that was my moment where I stayed up all night. That's where I learned that language, John, around which we could speak. And Catholic social thought literally changed my politics, changed my ethics, changed my life. And so I just also, as well as thanking you, John, I do want to acknowledge my eternal debt to the teachings of the Church, which have guided me to this point. And this is what I wish to talk about tonight, is my, you could say, devout belief is that the wisdom of Catholic social thought is the great hope for our nation, that is the great hope for our country. That it offers the framework within which we can renew all the different multiple crises of the relationships that we are now experiencing. And I wish to talk about that as well. So John and I usually begin our talks with exactly the same quote, and we've been doing it now for 4 to 5 years, which is, Pope Francis. By the way, I did meet Pope Francis, and he was completely astonished. He just said to me, "England? Who would have thought England?" He said, and I said, "You're going to have to rethink the periphery." And it was a kind of interesting exchange. He couldn't believe that there was a politics of the common good, that there was a politics around Catholic social thought in our country. It was literally shocking. So that was the nature of our brief but intense conversation. He just kept on saying, "Inglaterra, Inglaterra." I said, "Sí, Inglaterra." So I do believe that that we have the power and the tradition to renew this thought. And Pope Francis, he said in 2018, I think, he said that we're not living through an era of change, but we're living through a change of era. And I think that a huge amount of the discombobulation is that people haven't caught up with this change of era, what's happening. And that's because I believe that we were in a kind of mirage, a kind of trance-like state for about 40 years. You might call it the era of globalization, where borders didn't matter, politics didn't matter, technology would determine the nature of things, it knew no borders. There was a rights-based, a rules-based system, and essentially it generated really huge inequalities, concentrations of unaccountable power, but these were never really talked about. So I would say that one of the features of the new era that we live in, and this really came out, and by the way, huge respect to this church for staying open during COVID. This is something that the idea that the light stayed on, I was completely, I think the 1970s word to betray my age would be freaked out by the idea that the lights would go off in the churches, that there would be no place for people to orientate themselves and to find the light in the darkness, that was a real fear. And so I was extremely impressed that this particular church kept the lights on. I mean, my family, when they came over as immigrants in 1905, they came to Soho. This is a place I know, and it was a very different place. Do you remember the Maltese Mafia? They were here, and the Italians, they were here. The Chinese at that point were just one community among many. There was a small synagogue on Dean Street that the family used to go to. So this is an ancestral homeland in many ways. And the first feature of this, and we had to recognize this in COVID because we haven't really discussed this as a nation fully, but there was a horror, and the horror that emerged in COVID was this absolute dependency on China for everything, that we had no capacity to make our own face masks, let alone our own ventilators, let alone the medicines that we needed, that this whole globalized world suddenly looked a lot more menacing than it did before. And this has led ineluctably to the reality that there's a much bigger role for the state in the organization of the economy. In other words, that there's more space for politics in the organization of the economy. And the second feature, which I think is very important, is that, in the faraway towns, we're here, Soho ultimately is in the hub of a global hub. It's a global city linked, but the faraway towns, Grimsby, Bolton, Preston, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, we could list the places. All these places were essentially abandoned during that era of globalization, and the people who lived there were called the left behind, or the losers. Do you remember that one? The losers of globalization. And well, they kind of made their voices heard, and this is what I ask you to understand. That was all part of the shocking reality of what happened in the Brexit vote. It was understood in London as some horrible, diabolical, racist, nasty event. If you went out to those places, they just said to me, if we don't do this, no one will listen to us ever again. That was their view. So, and then we had in 2019, do you remember that? There was a new class coalition, the victory of the Conservatives under Boris Johnson, with working class voters voting Conservative for the first time in possibly 80 to 90 years, if they'd ever voted that way before. So the first is a bigger role for the state in the economy. The second is that far from being the left behind and the losers, working class people in small towns now decide our general elections. This is a new reality and requires a recognition. And the third aspect relates to that the places that they live are now at the centre of the political battle. So that's one of the things that that has changed in this change of era. But there are other aspects, and so to those without faith, you might say, the world is a scary place right now. That's how it feels. There is a war, a real war going on in Europe. That, you know, today is the year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. And I remember the day before the invasion, I was told by so many people in Parliament that the Russians would not invade, that there would not be a war. That was the general consensus. But now this war has been going on for a year and there is no way out of it. There's no discernible end to the war. We will have to live with this reality for many years. And there is a transhuman assault on our bodies and all that is sacred. We discussed this briefly just before we came in, but nature and human beings are now desecrated and degraded. And it even seems that the profession of a Christian faith disbars you from public office. If you follow what's going on with the election to be the next leader of the SNP. But I would say that it's even more severe. It's the profession of a Christian faith bars you from public office, because Hamza Yusuf, who's Muslim, that doesn't seem to be a problem. But for the other candidate who is Christian, there is a really strong reaction saying that she should not stand. And Karl Marx said, all that's solid melts into air and everything holy is profaned. The world can look that way. It's just to acknowledge the power of that analysis, that there seems to be an endless desecration of human beings and of nature that is systematic. But I would say that this is precisely where Catholic social thought comes in. It was Archbishop Wilhelm von Kettler, the Rerum Novarum, the first encyclical, 1892? 91. Now, this is an important matter. I got it wrong in the book. So it's 1891. Erratum correction, 1891. Was a kind of miracle in itself that this was produced. It was an extraordinary piece of work. And the two prime movers were Cardinal Manning from here, who did such extraordinary work during the dock strike, and a German Archbishop of Mainz called Archbishop Wilhelm von Kettler. And he came up with a very, very important quote. He said, "If we are wrong, then Marx is right." That's what he said. So it's very, very important that we renew our faith in this tradition and what it gives us. Because there are multiple crises of trust and of relationship. One of those is with the church itself, which has lost trust of people, engagement. That's one very, very significant part of it. But also with the financial system. You would have thought that 2008 would have been enough to warn us about exaggeration, about excessive debt, about self-remuneration of executives, of the way that the banking system profits, but it wasn't enough. We all still have a looming sense of a debt-fueled crisis that could really be significant and affect the financial system. In our politics, there's also a very severe breakdown of trust. The challenges are extremely great, but the politics seems to be excessively small in response. There is very little vision of how things could be different. And that is the great gift that was given to us by the church, urbi et orbi, to the cities and the world. It was given as a gift, so that it can order our thoughts and guide our actions in order to rebuild trust and relationships and to rebuild society. So I just want to begin there with an important reflection. I think I've called the talk From Contract to Covenant. So I just want to say a little about what that means and what that's about. So we've been living increasingly in a contractual society. So a contract essentially is an exchange of equivalence between hands. I give you money, you give me a phone. And then contractual relationships also characterize welfare. You go to the doctor, he gives you a prescription, it's the end of the relationship. It's an isolated event in time, is a contract. It ignores all the inequalities that surround it, all the different forms of power that surround it. But a covenant is a binding agreement through time. It's a sense of obligation, and the fundamental feature of a covenant is that it is intergenerational. It links the dead to those not yet born. I think that may be why Michael Gove thought that maybe I was a conservative thinker, but I'm saying I have great respect for the conservative tradition, definitely, but the Catholic tradition is greater yet. So this is what I would say. But this idea that we need to think of ourselves as social beings embedded in place, embedded and embodied beings who are inheritors from the past and shaping the future, rather than abstract individuals or individuals with careers who are just pursuing our ambitions. That's what was going on in that quote earlier. So the important thing is to just stress that it's intergenerational, and that if you weaken the bonds of covenantal obligation, you get what we now have. So what we had in the era of globalization, which we now can barely understand but can begin to understand, is that capital, money, the City of London, entirely broke its obligation to anybody in this country. And it became global. So you just invested wherever there was a greater degree of return. What they saw was that in China, there were no free and democratic trade unions. There was no dissent. There was 24-hour-a-day guaranteed production with no society to kick back. That's one of the great paradoxes of our time, is that communism gave us the most perfect society for capital to accumulate. And we have to understand with good humor that these are the truth of the world that we see. And we lived, many of us, through this period where we deindustrialized, where we withdrew from precisely the places that have wreaked their revenge from the north, from the Midlands, invested in China because the returns were higher. But now we live in a world where we understand that China could conceivably be a hostile state, where the lack of liberty gives them a huge concentrated power, where there is a very, very, very servile population in many ways, serving exclusively national ends, and bear in mind a state that is extremely hostile to liberty, to the freedom of religion, to the freedom of expression, to the freedom of association, that are the very foundations of our liberty, then you understand where losing any sense of covenantal obligation leads, because the rich were free to invest wherever they wished. They had no obligations to anybody here. They invested that way, and it turns out that they made a potentially enemy power much stronger. You see this as well with the breaking of the covenantal bonds in relation to the whole debate in relation to sexuality, is that there is no obligation. Family life is attenuated, disintegrating. Concepts of, in a covenant, there's different sides to this, and what other people think of you is very important. But if it's just a matter of self-definition, then literally anything goes. And we saw that, and it's important for me to kind of reiterate it. We saw that as well in politics, that if you're not accountable to the people, if you're bound by all these treaties, and if your obligation is to fulfill those treaties in relation to elites in other countries, then there is going to be a breakdown of a covenantal obligation between the generations. And that's one of the things I think that was going on during the Brexit vote. And we're still living with it. So I think that deep down, covenant, a sense of inherited obligation to the dead, to the living, and to those yet born, is the secret heart of Catholic social thought. That this is what it gives us, a way of understanding ourselves as beings in time, with faith and a faithfulness to our inheritance, and with hope that the future is better. So this is another thing about covenant, is that it situates us in time. And if you dig deep enough into the ancient constitution, then we can begin to see the English church rather than the Church of England. You can begin to see a different settlement and a different role, I think, and this is where I think that there is a redemption in Catholic social thought for the church, because in this, the calling of the church everywhere and in each generation is revealed. So let's just have a look for a while at how this covenantal thinking shapes Catholic social thought and what its meaning is. And so the first aspect that I think is extremely important, rerum novarum means this new thing. And what is this new thing that they're talking about? This new thing was capitalism. There was capital. And it emerged, if you think that Marx was writing in 1848, almost exactly contemporaneous to Archbishop Kettler. By the way, these things were going on in tandem. There was industrialization, there was the impoverishment of early industrialization, the creation of this proletariat. And what the Catholic Church said, well, a human being is not a commodity. A human being has something sacred about it. And that sacredness was given by the status of the person, that a person had a status in the world. And the concept that they used to try and express this was the concept of vocation, that everybody has a vocation. I always make the same joke around this point when I'm trying to explain vocation. You know, I got very heavily criticised, and sometimes still am, within the Labour Party for always working so closely with the church. And I always replied, well, at least people of faith and Christians, they don't believe that the free market created the world. You know, that they think that there was something at least anterior to that. But honestly, in policy discussions, you would think that that was true. And if they don't think that the free market created the world, they think that the state created the world. Those are the two basic options. But of course, we understand that God created the world, and human beings and nature are not commodities, they are an inheritance. And they can be trashed, and they can both be exploited, or they can be honoured and they can be treasured. And this is the really fundamental insight of Catholic social thought, is that human beings and nature are not owned by us. They're a gift of creation. And we are obliged to uphold their status. And this was done through the concept of a vocation, of a calling, that workers were not to be treated as commodities. And Catholic social thought put a very strong stress on guilds, on education, on apprenticeships, on what we would call a vocational status for the worker, where they would have protections against being treated exclusively as dispensable, or to use the word they love, fungible commodities. Well, if you don't do it, somebody else will do it, and if you don't like it, we'll invest in China. You know, these are the options that people were given, and, you know, it is that the church upheld the dignity of labour, the status of the worker was extremely fundamental in the development of that, and I think that that needs to be restored and restated as a fundamental aspect. The second aspect of Catholic social thought, which was remarkable, was this concept of subsidiarity, which is not a pleasing word, not a very pleasing word at all. But subsidiarity means that power should be exercised at the lowest level commensurate with its function. So there's a whole gradation of different and appropriate levels, but the most local level appropriate. And this is because Catholic social thought understood something very early, which was that this combination of capitalism and statism would abolish the idea of place. That place would no longer matter. So the whole parish system of the church, the importance and holiness of place, no, what they wanted was liquid nodes through a material reality, that frictionless trade, that things can, and you know, obviously the internet was their dream, that you didn't need to live anywhere, that you could do everything by Zoom, that it was absolutely contrary to the idea of human beings as embedded and embodied beings in place. And this idea that place didn't matter was extremely important. And so through the concept of subsidiarity, they renewed this idea that we live together in places, that association and trust is generated by human relationships. And subsidiarity is the second, if you like, pillar of the leg of the table. So you have the dignity of labour, subsidiarity, and then the third concept is solidarity, which is that there are obligations from rich to poor and obligations from poor to rich, that there's a common good can be generated, but this common good, and this is where Father John and I really came together, that was the whole point with the organising. That was the whole point, is that if the weak and the poor are disaggregated and powerless, then they will be done to. You know, then you will be done to by the powers that be, who will do what they will. So it's very, very important to build, you know, this is central to Catholic social thought that Pope Francis has brought out very strongly. There's money power, we know what that is. You can buy power, you can buy influence, you can buy things. There's state power, is you can get arrested if we don't like it. There's collective coercive state power. What Catholic social thought is talking about is relational power, the power of association, the power of people to live, work and build community together and have some form of voice in the way that they are governed. I think this is a crucial aspect of the meaning of solidarity. Once again, solidarity is having loyalty to people, having trust in people through time. That's an aspect of this covenantal thinking. And the fourth aspect is stewardship. And this is stewardship of nature. That once again, and this confronts us with one of the realities of our time is you know, God created the world, but you wouldn't know that if you look at the distribution of intellectual property, if you look at the distribution of ownership. Nature is there to be exploited and to be benefited from. So there has to be a concerted stewardship and advocacy for the integrity of our natural environment. So those are the four aspects of Catholic social thought that work together. The dignity of the worker, the status of the worker, the importance of local, of place, of local power, of that being of the participation of people through association. It's all the way through is the power of association, of public assembly, of which Catholic social thought says the greatest expression of that is in the Eucharist and in the Mass, that people are together in one they become one body. And they extended that to the idea of workers' associations, of university associations. These are all forms of corporate association with the body and the integrity of the body, which doesn't belong to the individual, but is built by individuals across time and generate a sense of belonging, commitment, and morality. And then the third element is this solidarity of being responsible for others and actively participating in showing that. And then the fourth aspect is stewardship. So you could say status, subsidiarity, solidarity, and stewardship form the legs of the table of Catholic social thought. And this addresses really fundamentally, Father John is always saying to me, look for the signs of the times. You know, what is going on? Increasing centralization leads to a sense of estrangement, conspiracy, and hostility. There has to be a redistribution of power. All of our efforts over the last 40 to 50 years have been to send people to university. In 1976, there was equal money spent on universities and apprenticeships. Now, it's literally 50 to 1. So 49 goes to the universities, 1 to vocation. This abandonment of vocation, of good work. You know, I describe virtue as good doing rather than do-gooding. It's a skillful application of a practice. That's been neglected, but that needs many, many levels to be resurrected and renewed. An idea, I call it, of a vocational economy. So that links up completely to the dignity of labour, the decentralisation and the importance of association and participation by local people links up to the subsidiarity. We need to actively renew our sense of solidarity within the society, our sense of obligation, generosity, one to the other. And this applies between classes, this applies between regions very much. And within that framework, to reaffirm and not be embarrassed about talking about the holiness of our inheritance, the holiness and the sacred nature of the human person and of our natural environment, and to defy a technocratic, inhumane approach that seeks to turn everything into just the most efficient application of technology to the problem in hand. Now, as you can probably see, I could go on about this for a very long time, but I'm aware that it's a Friday night. Is that, I mean, I've just got a sense, a murmuring sense, that would be enough. So I'm really open to any questions that you have and anything there. But before I finish, remember, I'm an academic and a politician and a Jew, so it's very difficult to get me to be quiet. I wanted to say, Our Lady of Ransom, and to you, Juan, and to you, Naz, really thank you for this invitation, and I hope it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation. Thank you.